All right, let's dive into hiring Micropython developers. It's a super interesting area, especially with the whole IoT thing exploding. This deep dive should help you figure out if a Micropython developer is something that you need for your project. And then if so, how to find the perfect one. We're going to be looking at some insights from the perfectdeveloper.com today. They really know their stuff when it comes to developers. Actually, they have this really cool tool called the 5 questions that can help you find the right developer. You should check it out at theperfectdeveloper.com. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating field. It kind of sits right in between software and hardware, so you need a pretty unique skill set.
So first things first, for anyone who's hearing Micropython and thinking of tiny snakes coding, what exactly are we talking about here?
Well, think of it like Python's smaller, tougher cousin. It's made to run on those microcontrollers. Those are the tiny chips that power everything, from smart thermostats to those fitness trackers you wear. So instead of your code running on a computer, it's running right on the device.
Makes sense. So what about the developers? What makes them different from a regular software developer?
Well, they're not just writing code. They're practically talking to the hardware. They really need to understand how the code works with the physical stuff, and they often have very limited resources to work with. It's like fitting a huge program onto something smaller than your thumb.
So they're like masters of efficiency, like those people who can fit a week's worth of clothes in a carry-on.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And just like those expert packers, they have to be super organized and careful, debugging, finding and fixing errors in the code. It becomes a whole art form when you're working with both software and hardware.
Sounds like a pain. Speaking of pain, let's talk about the big question. Cost. How much should you expect to pay for a Micropython developer?
Well, it really depends on where you're hiring and how much experience you need. ThePerfectDeveloper.com actually has some good info on this. For example, a really experienced developer in the US. They could easily make over $120,000 a year, but someone just starting out might be closer to $80,000.
Okay, so it's not cheap, but you're getting someone who can make your hardware actually do cool stuff. What about other parts of the world?
Europe is pretty similar, at least Western Europe. But if you're looking in Asia or Latin America, you might find some cheaper options, maybe starting around $15,000 a year. But it's important to remember, theperfectdeveloper.com emphasizes, finding the right developer, not just the cheapest.
Right, because a bad hire can cost you way more in the long run.
Yeah.
So you've got your budget, you kind of know what you're looking for. How do you actually find these Micropython wizards?
Well, you could try those job boards or LinkedIn. But specialized platforms like theperfectdeveloper.com, they're built to connect you. With developers who really know Micropython, they often even pre-vet the candidates, which saves you a ton of time.
It's like a matchmaker for developers. Instead of a date, they help you find the perfect person to build your product.
Exactly. They look at your specific needs, your project's complexity, even things like company culture to make sure it's a good fit.
Okay, cool. So say you've got some potential candidates lined up. How do you know if they're the real deal? What skills should you be looking for besides just knowing Python?
Well, Micropython development is all about squeezing the most out of limited resources. So you really want someone who's like an optimization pro. Those tiny low-power devices, they don't have the luxury of big servers to do all the work.
So it's not just about code that works. It's got to be lean and mean, right?
Absolutely. Another big one is experience with real-time systems. That's where things get a little more complicated.
Oh, this is where it gets interesting. What do you mean by real-time systems?
It means the code has to react to things happening in the real world, and it has to react instantly. Think about a self-driving car or like a medical device. Those need to respond immediately.
Wow. That adds a whole other layer of complexity. So you're not just looking for a Python coder. You need someone who can make it work with hardware in real time.
Exactly. And that brings us to another skill, communication protocols. Think of them like the languages that different parts of the system use to talk to each other.
So if the microcontroller is the brain, these protocols are like the nerves sending signals.
Perfect analogy. Some common ones you'll see in MicroPython are I2C and SPI.
Okay, so your developer needs to speak these hardware languages. But let's get back to those resource limits. I imagine that really changes how you approach development.
Absolutely. You can't just throw more power or memory at the problem like you might with, regular software.
So what does that mean for the development process?
Well, it often means being more iterative. You're constantly testing and refining the code to make sure it actually fits within the limits of the hardware.
So it's like building a house on a tiny island. You have to be really careful about what you include and how you arrange everything.
That's a great way to put it. And it really highlights how important it is to have a developer who's used to working within those kinds of limits.
Okay, so we've talked about the skills and the challenges. Now for the big question. Local or global? Does it matter where you find your MicroPython developer?
That's a great question. And it really depends on what you need and what's most important to you. Let's break it down for our listener, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it. So what are the pros and cons of hiring local versus going global?
Well, hiring someone local is great for, working together. You can have those in-person meetings, brainstorm on a whiteboard, maybe even visit the lab if they need to use your specific hardware. But that also might mean you have fewer people to choose from, and it could be more expensive.
Right. Makes sense. On the other hand, going global opens up way more possibilities, and you might find people with really diverse experiences.
Yeah, exactly. You could find some amazing talent in unexpected places. And let's be honest, sometimes the cost savings can be huge.
True. But I can also see some potential issues, like time zones, language barriers, even just different ways of working.
Yeah, those are definitely things to consider. That's why the perfectdeveloper.com really emphasizes figuring out exactly what you need and what your priorities are before you even start looking. They have some really good advice on how to navigate the global talent pool.
Sounds like the main takeaway is there's no one right answer. You have to weigh your options and see what works best for your specific project.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for help. There are resources out there that can help you through this process, and make sure you're making the best decision.
All right, this has been a great overview of MicroPython. We've talked about what it is, what these developers do, and some of the key skills and challenges involved. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll go even deeper into the world of MicroPython development and how to set your project up for success.
Welcome back to our deep dive, all about those MicroPython developers.
So last time, we went over the basics of MicroPython and the skills these developers need. This time, I think it'd be good to talk about something that can really make or break a project, especially with remote teams. Communication.
Oh yeah, communication is key. You've got developers speaking code, hardware folks talking circuits, and then project managers trying to keep everyone on the same page. It can be like a tech version of the Tower of Babel sometimes.
And just like in that story, if no one understands each other, nothing gets built.
Yeah.
So how do you avoid those communication breakdowns, especially when you've got all these technical details flying around?
Well, the perfectdeveloper.com really stresses setting up clear communication channels and protocols right from the beginning. Don't just assume everyone knows how to communicate well, especially when everyone's remote.
So it's not just about having the right tools like Slack or email. It's about setting some ground rules for how to use them.
Exactly. Think of it like you wouldn't just start building a house without a blueprint. You need a framework for how everyone's going to talk to each other. Maybe you have different channels for different types of messages, or set expectations for response times, even a system for escalating problems if they come up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So everyone knows where to go for information, how to get their questions answered, and how to flag a problem before it, blows up.
Right, and that's where those project management tools can be super helpful. Think about using something like Jira or Asana. You can track tasks, assign responsibilities, and document your progress so everyone can see.
So everyone's literally on the same page, even if they're miles apart.
Yeah.
And it creates accountability, too. Everyone can see who's doing what and when it's due.
You got it. Visibility and accountability. Those are some of the biggest challenges with remote teams. And good communication can really help.
So we've got our tools and channels figured out. But what about the actual content of the messages? How do you make sure everyone understands each other? Especially with all the, the technical stuff.
One of the most important things is clear, concise language. It sounds simple, but it's easy to slip into jargon or make assumptions.
Right, like that old saying, assume makes an impouche may. Well, you know the rest.
Exactly. So instead of throwing around acronyms and technical terms, take the time to explain things so everyone gets it.
And don't be afraid to ask if something's not clear. It's much better to ask up front than to let a misunderstanding cause problems later.
I totally agree. The perfectdeveloper.com even suggests creating a glossary of common terms and acronyms that the whole team can use.
That's a great idea, especially for new team members. It's like a MicroPython dictionary for everyone.
Right.
What about visual aids? I bet those could be super helpful, especially when you're talking about hardware.
Absolutely. Things like diagrams, flowcharts, even just sketches, they can be super powerful for showing how things work and for spotting potential problems.
Yeah, it's like trying to explain how to tie a knot. Sometimes a picture's just way easier than words.
And those visuals are great for documenting decisions and troubleshooting. Instead of just saying the sensor's not working, you can have a diagram that shows exactly what's going on.
That takes out a lot of the guesswork, which saves a ton of time.
Speaking of time, how do you manage deadlines and expectations when everyone's in different time zones?
The time zone juggling act. That's where clear communication and being flexible is super important. You need a system for tracking progress, communicating deadlines, and letting everyone know if there are any delays.
So having a clear timeline, regular check-ins, maybe even a project management tool that adjusts deadlines for different time zones.
Exactly. And don't forget to just be mindful of other people's time zones. Try to schedule meetings at times that work for everyone. Or at least rotate the time so no one's always stuck with a bad time.
Right. It's all about being considerate, even if you're not in the same room.
Absolutely. And that leads to another really important part of remote teams, building rapport and trust.
Okay, but how do you do that when everyone's remote?
Well, theperfectdeveloper.com suggests adding in some fun, informal activities, alongside all the work stuff. So not just project updates and reports, but also those, like, virtual coffee breaks, where people can just connect on a personal level.
Exactly. Those informal chats might seem small, but they're actually really important for building relationships and trust, and that makes everyone work together better.
Yeah, it's like the difference between being colleagues and being friends. You're more likely to help out someone you actually connect with.
And when you're doing something as complex as Micropython development, that extra effort can really make a difference.
This has been a really great look at communication for remote Micropython teams. We've talked about setting up clear channels and building those important relationships.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore, especially when it comes to the unique challenges and opportunities of managing a remote team.
Well, stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll tackle all of that head on and give you some real tips for making your next MicroPython project a success. All right, welcome back to our final part of this deep dive on hiring MicroPython developers.
We've covered a lot of ground, from what MicroPython even is to those really specialized skills these developers have. And of course, how important good communication is.
Right, but there's still one big piece of the puzzle: how to actually manage a remote MicroPython team.
That's where things get really interesting, because you're not just managing people. It's like this whole mix of hardware, software, and teams that could be anywhere in the world.
That sounds like it could get messy pretty fast.
Yeah.
How do you keep everything running smoothly when your team is, spread across all these different time zones?
Theperfectdeveloper.com has some great advice on this. They really stress treating remote team management like a specialized skill.
So it's not just about being a good manager in general. You need to know the ins and outs of leading a team that's not physically together.
Exactly. You have to think differently about communication, collaboration, and even how you build trust and a sense of team spirit.
So let's break that down a bit. What are some of the key differences between managing a traditional in-office team and a remote one, especially when we're talking about MicroPython development?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is not being in the same place. You can't just walk over to someone's desk and ask a quick question or have a brainstorming session.
And when you're working with hardware, that can be a real problem. You can't exactly send a microcontroller through a Zoom call.
You got it. So you really have to be intentional about how people communicate and work together. You might need to invest in some remote debugging tools so your developers can access the hardware from anywhere.
So it's like a virtual lab.
Yeah.
Where everyone can experiment together, even if they're miles apart.
Exactly. And this also makes documentation super important. When you can't just have a quick chat, clear documentation becomes essential for sharing knowledge and fixing problems.
That makes a lot of sense. If you can't easily ask someone, you need a reliable way to find the answers yourself. But what about the more human side of things, like building trust, keeping everyone motivated? How do you do that when you're not face-to-face?
That's where getting creative and really making an effort to connect comes in. Theperfectdeveloper.com really emphasizes building a strong team culture, even if you're not all in the same office.
Yeah, but how do you actually do that? It's easy to say build a culture, but it's harder to actually make it happen.
Well, it takes effort. You could schedule those virtual coffee breaks, or maybe have some team building activities just to give people a chance to chat and get to know each other better.
So you're trying to recreate those casual moments that happen in an office.
Yeah.
Where you're not just talking at work.
Exactly. And maybe make an effort to celebrate successes together, even if it's just a quick message in a team chat.
It's about acknowledging each other, even when you're not physically there.
Another important thing is giving people ownership over their work.
But isn't that risky with a remote team? How do you know people are staying on track?
It's about finding that balance, between giving people freedom and making sure they're accountable.
So you're not micromanaging. You're setting clear goals, deadlines, and trusting your team to do the work.
Right, and this goes back to having that strong communication framework we talked about, regular check-ins, progress reports, making it easy for people to ask questions. Those are all essential.
It really seems like communication is the key to everything.
It really is. It's the foundation for any successful remote team, especially when it comes to something as complex as Micropython.
I think this deep dive has been really insightful. We've learned a lot, from the technical stuff about Micropython to the human side of building and managing a remote team.
We've looked at the challenges, the benefits, and hopefully given some practical strategies for making it all work.
And I can't stress enough how helpful resources like theperfectdeveloper.com can be.
Absolutely. Whether you're just starting to build a team or you're looking to, grow your existing one, they have the tools and the know-how to help you find that perfect Micropython developer.
And before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone about that 5 questions tool on theperfectdeveloper.com. It's a great way to start your search and really figure out what you need.
It's quick and easy, and it can save you a lot of time and hassle in the long run.
So go check it out at theperfectdeveloper.com and see what amazing things you could create. With a talented Micropython developer on your team, the possibilities are truly endless. Thanks for joining us.